Well, hi everyone. Today I'm joined by a good mate of mine, Robin Fewster, who is the head of InfoSec and AppSec testing at Hargreaves Lansdown. And today we are going to share some of our chronicles of discussion that we've, I suppose, been going through together in our journey of knowing each other. And I think the best thing we need to do really is get some context. So, Rob, do you want to just give us a background as to where you've come from? Because you've had a really interesting history and you love to pick up challenges.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to this as well. I've worked in cybersecurity for about 23 years now, which is quite a while. It feels like quite a while. I started out as a software developer just for 1 year, found out I wasn't very good at that. And then subsequently got into sort of breaking things, pretty much sort of penetration testing. That's as early as sort of about 2003, 2004. So quite a long career of pen testing at various different places, but I've kind of delved into kind of auditing as well. I worked at Mastercard on there before the PCI Standards Council was formed. That was quite interesting, kind of looking at the formation of the Standards Council. And I was one of the guys that was assessing the vendors that wanted to be part of the approved scanning vendor program. So, it's kind of setting up the rigs and scoring the various different vulnerability scanning solutions. Yeah, I've worked as a consultant, but also sort of internally as well. I spent a long time at NCC Group and Leonardo doing consultancy. But I've also kind of been internal in organisations as well, such as Sage, for example, and now Hargreaves Lansdown. So done things like co-founded an application security team. I've also sort of created a new offensive security team as well in the past, and now here I'm at Hargreaves Lansdown. With the security testing team, trying to deliver sort of internal security testing that sort of integrates well with development teams and their processes and workflows. That's what I'm doing really.
Well, it's a big challenge, and I think quite you understate yourself in some ways, Rob. Because if I look back in your world, you did something quite special that very few people in our industry have done. And around, I think, if I'm right, 2014, you started challenging the way in which pen testing is done. And even to this day, I think many consultancies could listen to that advice. And in my journey, as you know, I've looked at that and, finally got the opportunity, after going through a number of acquisitions and things we built ourselves, we get to this point where you go, aha, I really have got this now. I know what to do. So tell me about the way your vision is for this and how really good pen testing and cybersecurity advisory fits into organizations, because I think you broke ground way earlier than the industry was ready to accept. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, it's true to say that I've been around a while, around the industry for a while. You're right in saying that, what is it, 10 years ago now, did a talk at QuestCon. I kind of discussed the challenges of the pen test industry and what they could do better. I kind of provided a perspective on, being a client of sort of cybersecurity technical advisory services, but also being a consultant delivering it, and also being an assessor from my sort of Mastercard days that I mentioned earlier on. I think it's quite interesting to see how so little has changed in many ways, I guess, because you still see a lot of sort of many more cybersecurity consultancies doing pretty much the same kind of things that didn't really quite work out so well. I think there's been some improvements though, because you tend to see kind of more streamlined approaches. You've got sort of like cybersecurity consultants with kind of like better integrations with issue trackers, and they've got portals where you can kind of like upload your sort of scope, and you can do things like decentralized responsibility for organizing pen tests, in like a multinational where you might have a security champions program and have, skilled enough people to sort of organize their own sort of pen tests on behalf of AppSec. But still, there's sort of all the same old problems like, long, extensive lead times, like over reliance on sort of scoping, PDF scoping documents, and lack of communication during the engagement. Just sort of inflexibility, really, I think, that especially sort of these days when you've got more rapid releases to production expected, in a kind of like a DevOps environment. It's like pen testing and other services like that kind of like need to sort of strongly consider how they fit into that more efficiently and effectively, I think.
I love your phrase, Rob. Same but different. Isn't that really quite an alarming thing, all this time later? And, you know, why is so little changed, and why are firms not raising their game and matching what their clients now need? It's not helping them, is it?
I think it is the same but different, as you say. It's kind of a term that's used from time to time in different areas, isn't it? And I think it's because fundamentally these organisations are still making enough money, to push these services. I mean, it's in the sense that it's kind of more heavily kind of expected as well. I mean, there's compliance, there's regulations that expect, or demand pen testing or make it mandatory. Yeah, I mean, you are seeing a lot more sort of organizations, internal companies kind of building their own internal capability, delivering the services internally. You do tend to see that a bit more. There's a bit of a flow of sort of pen test consultants from consultancies into organizations. But it's kind of it felt a little bit like at the low level at least, the sort of basic pen testing is sort of money for old rope to a degree. You're sort of doing the same test every year, finding the same things. I mean, I see that in quite a few different places. It's like, what's the value of this pen test? There's no sort of new vulnerability yield. You're finding the same things. Why aren't you doing something else, like a bug bounty program, or sort of building your internal capability, getting developers doing more threat hunting with the SOC, things like that. Sort of kind of be a little bit more sort of comprehensive and innovative in your approach to what is really essentially sort of technical security advisory services.
Well, we hear, don't we, to develop that theme, we hear the phrase quite a lot now, that pen testing is a commodity. And I'm going to argue, having lived my entire working career as you have pretty much in this area, bad pen testing is a commodity. Good pen testing, when mixed with high degrees of personalization and interactivity and thinking, is wildly value add. What's your thought?
I completely agree with you, and I certainly don't want to put a downer on the industry. There are some excellent consultancies out there. It's just a case of knowing what your organization needs and how to select the best approach. And it really should be more of a partnership, I think. What I would say is that it's almost, in my opinion anyway, sort of come full circle. So, and I suppose in the early days of pen testing, it was much more kind of open and innovative, and it was sort of less scripted. You had to compile your own exploits. You're setting up sort of netcat listeners and doing much more of that kind of thing. Whereas, obviously, so it's become sort of more sort of regulatory requirements, that sort of situation. You've got, PCI requiring it, you've got other standards requiring it, even some laws requiring it, I think in Australia, for example, for certain things. And so as a result of that, services have been sort of formulated, and it's been kind of rinse and repeat to a degree, and that's possibly the commoditization that we're speaking about. But I mean, certainly internally, when I'm looking at offensive security or technical security advisory services like pen testing, I mean, I just consider pen testing as just one tactic of many in offensive security, really. And it's just about getting more sort of expertise, better sort of collaboration between the consultants and your internal systems, almost treating them as part of the team, which I think is something you're keen on. And it's so in a way, it's gone full circle. I remember sort of early days, sort of just being invited to a particular client, sort of plugging in the network, and it's almost like, see what you can do. And now that's considered, like a red team engagement, where in the past that arguably that was just standard pen testing. And in the middle somewhere, you've got increased sort of standards, regulations, compliance expectations, laws even, and services formulated and duplicated for that. And a lot of companies have made a lot of money out of it, but I think that there must be sort of tight profit margins for those consultancies that are just offering very sort of bog standard pen tests these days, surely. Especially in light of other things like crowdsourced pen testing, pen test as a service, which in of itself isn't doing brilliantly well, in my opinion. So there's quite a lot going on, I think, and a lot to think about.
I think we're at this beautiful plateau, Rob. It's made me very, very energized in that we're seeing tool saturation, tool overlap, data deluge. We're seeing breaches when people have got everything in place, which arguably, even if it's logging everything, it's not seen. So, this is, as you say, it's a very, very valuable tool if yielded in the right way. You've said raise the bar. You've also said partnership. I really admire firms that build their own capability internally, but even more so when we are brought in to be part of that team as a welcome partnership, because that magic there. Now you've got context, you've got tacit knowledge, you've got people who get what's needed, and we can also just get rid of so many layers of inefficiency, engagement, engagement and scopes triggered through Teams and Slack, no lead time, reduce scopes with high value, getting in early on the life cycle. But it takes people like you who've had that thinking for many years to not only build those teams, but to then say, come on, sit down this side of the desk with me. We want to be a partnership. And that magic that happens in that is just absolutely extraordinary. Do you think that the industry is just still stuck in this, we're better than our client mode? We're more skilled and, what's the word, elite? That kind of arrogance, if you like?
Well, possibly, yeah, and some of it would be justified. You do have a lot of sort of elite sort of consultancies out there, and rightly so. They're highly skilled. But on the flip side, you've got a lot of companies or organizations that are not really sort of offering much more than could be done internally. I mean, I've found in my experience that when you join an internal organization and you become part of the team, and you have some sort of responsibility for security testing, pen testing, offensive security testing, whatever you want to call it. You basically you get closer to the developers, you get closer to the security architects,
Yes.
software architects, and you find out, they'll open up to you. You build relationships. They'll tell you where the skeletons are hidden, and it's that often the sort of that information that you glean from those conversations are much more than, and they have to be trusted conversations. You have to sort of build their trust, know that there's not going to be some kind of blame culture, that you're going to sort of hold them accountable for what they've observed. And those kind of nuggets of information are much more, are just as powerful as in some cases as some extraordinarily expensive consultancy that comes on site or does it remotely and tells you the same thing or something slightly less than that. So there's certainly, you've got to measure the value of what you can do internally against and benchmark against what you can achieve externally. But I mean, there's a place for both, isn't there? It's just interesting, isn't it, to think about how that sort of knowledge is pretty much there, and it should never be underestimated. What an internal team of developers can tell you about the security. There's a lot of extremely security savvy developers out there, that if you just sort of paired them with the right kind of I know, pen testing capability or offensive security capability, you can really derive a really meaningful kind of remediation program from that and achieve some good outcomes. So it's just not that straightforward. It's not like, internal versus external. There's kind of like a lot of moving parts to that and sources of knowledge that need to be sort of utilized in the right way to derive the correct outcomes.
But you see that and you know how to champion that. And I think that's a really valuable point. Another thing you said to me last time we spoke was such a really interesting phrase, which is compliance. I mean, compliance is there to, make things safe, right? Ultimately, that's the goal, and to make sure that a certain standard is achieved, a minimum standard to the requirements of that compliance. But you also said then, interestingly, it sort of backfires in some ways, doesn't it? That compliance drains innovation. Tell me your thoughts about that, because I thought that was just such an interesting phrase.
Yeah, I suppose I have to sort of add colour to that is that, I suppose let's think about it in sort of offensive security terms. If you're required to do a pen test, I don't know, once a year, for instance, on a particular system, it could be your sort of main trading platform, for example. Your compliance efforts drain innovation in the sense that you're just inviting, in the worst case scenario at least, as consultants to just sort of follow some methodology. It's almost like a script. And to an extent, a large degree of it could be automated, and I suppose has been in some solutions, to be fair, automated pen test solutions. And if it can't be automated by pen test solutions, some of those tests could be automated internally as part of the SDLC anyway. So, but going back to the sort of draining innovation, it's like, well, where's the sort of time and space to think creatively about attacks? I suppose these days they're sort of much longer term kind of red team engagements, aren't they? That might occur over a series of months potentially, albeit with pauses in it. And you're pen testing. If you've been giving like 3 days to pen test a web app and 1 day to write a report, that it's probably being done as a tick box exercise in many cases, but not all. How much time do you really have to sort of apply some innovation there, especially if you're in like some sort of sausage factory or something where you're kind of doing it week on week in, week out. You could sort of use that money and that time to just take a different approach and just as you've said, sort of be part of the team to a degree, like treat it more like a partnership than some sort of external consultancy coming in and then leaving, with no kind of domain knowledge or knowledge of the organization or continuity. And so, I suppose compliance can, to a degree, drain innovation or be a barrier to it at least.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the models that we've played around with various clients have been interesting. If you like we said, we take a big block of effort, whatever that size is, it doesn't matter. Usually it goes on those traditional things, and it's point in time and cliff edge consultancy, that kind of stuff, where come in, as you say, don't have the context, maybe a little bit of a scoping session, and that's it. And then off someone goes with the OS top 10. I mean, it's not the greatest, is it? And the variation that you get in that is down to someone's motivation, how creative they are, the years in the cycle and experience, all that kind of stuff. But if we then slice that and say, okay, there's a bunch of this time that we can use for the important things which are related to the business, so your compliance and other related regulatory functions, assertions and stuff, fine, let's get those out the way. But now, if you've got that wonderful team who want to drive a standard that's higher than compliance, or go outside the scope of that, do security properly, if you want to view it like that, we can play with the rest of that kind of effort in a different way. Who says that people can't just say, can you have a quick look at this for me? It's fascinating. I mean, it's the same in the law world, isn't it? You ask a lawyer, can you give me a quick opinion on it? There's no such thing. There's going to be, firstly, a whole bunch of barriers in the way, which is them caveating what they're going about to do. And then there's a whole bunch of work which is way greater than the scope that you asked for. And it seems to me that pen testing is the same thing. It's like, can you have a quick look at me? Yes. Okay, let's build a scope. All right, that's 10, 20 days. No, can you just have a quick look at this? Can you apply a threat model? Can we use you as if we're a extension to team, part of my own team, to bring extra eyes on something? When we do that, it's magical. But Rob, why is there such a barrier to this? Has our industry just trained the consumers of these services that's the old way is the only way, kind of, as you say, same but different?
Well, I suppose it's quite interesting what you say. I mean, I fully agree that's a really powerful thing to do, to just have a look at something. I suppose you do look at all these other sort of domains, such as law and other, sort of areas of bodies of knowledge. And I suppose it comes down to the professionalization of the industry to a degree. You have like chartered accountants, for example. You have various other qualifications and such, and that comes with a package of process and steps and procedures. And often the high value, if you've engaged with any expert, it comes down to the actual sort of having a look and having a bit of a think and a conversation. But there's all the other stuff that surrounds it, which is costly, expensive, not just in terms of finance but time. But if you can cut that out, cut to the chase and sort of deliver value more directly with less steps, then that's what you could consider to be a shorter lead time, isn't it, or shorter process time? And how do you get that whilst remaining professional? That would be an interesting challenge, I suppose. Because if you think about what we're trying to achieve, we're trying to sort of deliver higher value quicker, with less cost. You could challenge lawyers to do the same, for example. I just wonder if that professionalization of the industry to a degree has led to the so-called commoditisation and process tax, if you want to call it that. There's like a tax involved in terms of the overhead, the onerous processes that must be followed, and maybe that's sort of inflected by compliance and regulation to a degree. How do you sort of separate that from just having a look, and adding high value? I guess you can have NDAs and be considered a partner and sort of charge for time and materials and have access to systems if permitted by an organization, and have consultants on demand if you can facilitate their availability in that way. It's quite an interesting challenge, isn't it? But I kind of totally understand what you're getting at there.
I think it's magical because at the end of the day, what are we bringing to the table? We're trying to solve cybersecurity problems and make people safe, right? you don't have to follow the same old way. We don't have to be flamboyant in our protesting about how cool we are. You know, quiet and subtle is good. You can still be amazing and quiet and subtle. Client service is absolutely fundamental, and it's such a random, you know, soup out there, if that makes sense. But I think the biggest word that we've thrown around together is friction. It just doesn't need to be friction in this. Why cannot a piece of effort, let's not call it work, a piece of effort, piece of thinking, be instructed through Slack? There's no reason why it can't. Why can't reporting go into a Kanban or a client's own workflow where it's super embedded into the processes that they design? You know, why do we need 3, 4, 5, 6+ weeks in terms of notice when actually 24 hours will do if you build your model correctly, and it can be done like that? And why does why does the client vendor descriptive language still sit out there when it doesn't need to? You're still that commercially, but you don't have to be that as a team, do you?
And a lot of interesting points made there. Yeah. So there's a lot of why not, you know, in there, in what you said. And to a degree, why not? You know, indeed. There's probably a number of answers, but they're probably not good ones. But yeah, in terms of what you're trying to achieve, yeah, you have to think about who's actually doing the work, who's making products and services more secure, you know, an underlying sort of on-premise hybrid cloud infrastructure more secure, who's doing that work. Are these I mean, you've got to also think about the fact that external consultants in some organizations tend to be sort of more highly regarded than internal colleagues, and yet the internal colleagues could actually be kind of more qualified and have more access to knowledge. And that comes down to sort of culture, I think, really. But also, again, sort of regulation, compliance, and expectations around how you approach this type of work. But when you kind of like remove all of that and think about who's doing what, who's looking at systems, who's advising on them, who's making the changes, you know, you can kind of consider the problem statement somewhat differently, and then the solution for it in terms of achieving better security. But you know, I mean, like you mentioned sort of threat modeling, for example. I think in the past, I mean, ideally developers would be doing that, but you know, when you speak to a lot of developers about it, depending on the maturity of your organization, they're not necessarily sort of, you know, a lot of them are security savvy, but some of them don't see that security as part of their job, and some do. You know, but you know, so it just take threat modeling an example. I mean, it's just like asking just a few basic questions about any change that you're about to introduce, and just thinking about security each step of the way. And you know, a lot of people sort of I've spoken to in the past when trying to build things like security champions programs, they tend to sort of feel that security role would be somehow a burden, you know, or they'd suddenly have to be the security expert in their area or team or function. But that they shouldn't really feel like that. It's more that they bother to think about security, and they are regarded as experts, and they know their systems better than anyone else, ideally. And if you compare that with some sort of external resource that can sort of, you know, they've got the NDA in place, they've got access to, you know, your issue trackers, you know, they're able to sort of be available at short notice. They can communicate over Slack or Teams or whatever you use. Kind of why not, really? You could set up a situation like that or an arrangement like that, in theory. And I'm not quite sure how to monetize that, but there must be, it's just a form of consultancy, I suppose. It's just a different way of approaching this than sort of, you know, let's go for pen test, you know, 2 weeks later, we may or may not have availability. By the way, we're booked up for 3 months, and then suddenly we've had a cancellation. Oh, but our internal environment isn't ready yet, and we didn't deliver our product on time. You know, we didn't deploy on time, and now we can't do the test. You've only done half a test. There's got to be a better way than that, you know. And by the way, we didn't tell you what we were working on when we did it. We didn't communicate with you, and 2 weeks later, you've got a PDF. I mean, there's got to be a better approach to sort of this type of security assurance than that.
Oh my goodness, Rob, I think you've captured the problem statement in the last 1 minute. You know, but isn't that it? It is absolutely so much friction and, you know, opportunity to really engage, and, you know, and then that drives the magic of, you know, collaboration, which I adore. Let's move on to something else, which is you briefly touched on. I mean, it's a simple question, really, which is, I know there's There's bodies out there in our industry which, you know, have a very important role. But why is our industry not chartered like an accountant? Why is there not a bar exam of sorts? You could argue that possibly there is, but you can't practice law until you have hit a certain level of maturity, in all jurisdictions pretty much. So why does that not apply to something that's equally important here now?
Yeah, well, we're going in that direction, aren't we? I think, I mean, when you cast your mind back, say 20 years, for example, there was no crest as such, for example, crest for the accrediting bodies. There's a plethora of cybersecurity degrees around these days. They're often endorsed. I think some of them by, is it the NCSC? I think some of them are. You can get sort of degrees with honours and that kind of thing. Yeah, a lot of the qualifications out there are good. The training courses out there are good. But yeah, you're quite right. It's not quite chartered as such. Didn't the British Computer Society try to do something with that? You can be like a member of the British Computer Society, but I don't know if you can be a chartered professional per se in this industry yet, can you? Is that desirable though? Is it a kite mark of some sort? I suppose it must be a sign of quality if you achieve that level. Well, maybe that's coming. It's still a relatively new industry, I suppose, in comparison to others. And I wouldn't be surprised if it reached that status at some point in the future, but I don't know if that's helpful or not. It could just add a more sort of processing cost potentially. I don't know. Genuinely don't know.
So the jury, if you like, is out on that one for me as well. All I know is it's left to people to build good relationships and standards themselves on top of what's out there, and draw those things together.
It's interesting that you mentioned standards there, and you mentioned the OWASP top 10 earlier on. I remember when I was working at Mastercard in 2006, the formation of the PCI Standards Council was coming about, and at that point there was only one OWASP top 10 list, but now there are many OWASP top 10s. And if you look at them, you've got OWASP top 10 for the standard one, you've got one for APIs, you've got one for large language models, you've got one for mobile apps. They're kind of, if you really sort of have a good look at them, they're pretty much the same kind of categories of vulnerability types or misconfiguration types that are just sort of worded differently, and it's just a bit of a sprawl, really. But it's interesting that I remember when the PCI Standards Council was being formed that they tried to bring in OWASP top 10 as a requirement, and it's like I remember people from OWASP, I won't name them, but I remember them in the meeting sort of arguing that OWASP top 10 was never meant to be used in a standard, and of course it is now in so many ways, but that was never the intent. And it just goes to show that that we're in a hurry, I guess, to regulate things. And I'm not sure that that's served as well in many ways, because it's quite hard, in my opinion, to kind of test against the OWASP top 10, because sometimes the kind of findings you come up against are sort of they could apply to multiple categories in the OWASP top 10, and then you've got CVEs, and then you've got CWEs, and there's a lot of overlap, and someone just needs to sort of have a good look at it and sort through it. But it's almost like out of control, in my opinion, and because of that, it's becoming less useful.
Well, it's interesting you say that. So let's build on that, because it's something that concerns me very, very greatly. You talk about commodity testing. Go back to the let's just say it's an oversimplified but fairly common example. Along comes pen tester on a Monday morning, opens laptop lid, fires up the coffee machine, and looks at the scope they're given. They may not have even had any form of interaction with that client. That scope has been done by them for someone else, and they open up and say, there's my connectivity. It might be very well organized and orchestrated. Great. Or access is ready, and off they go. Where's the context, what they're doing? Where's the threat model? Where's the risks that the client is trying to prove? Where is the creativity that sits out of this? Where is the bias within the business then saying, here are our business rules that we need to ensure are in place? OWASP top 10 doesn't do that. It's alarming.
Very good points raised. Yeah, very good points raised. I mean, I suppose that there's trust that you're bringing in an expert that offers something that you don't have. Your pen tester would have a certain level of knowledge and can follow certain methodologies, and regardless of their knowledge of your internal environment, they're going to find certain types of vulnerabilities based on their capability, which you hope is there, and it isn't always. It could be, you could have someone that's like a Salesforce expert testing something that they're not familiar with, because you can get away with that. So you're not necessarily getting the right person on the job, but it's not really, as you say, it's not really optimal, is it? Because you've got all that internal knowledge, you've got a threat model, and a threat model that doesn't necessarily have to be sort of in a certain shape or form. It could just be sort of even a list of technical threats that someone has, even if it's in their head. It's there in the business, and that pen tester in that sort of arrangement isn't necessarily geared up to go and ask those questions, speak to those people in the business, find that out, and use that in the consultancy that they end up delivering. And it's such a shame, isn't it? Because if they could do that, they'd be delivering so much more value. And it's about how you sort of formulate these engagements, and that sort of old-fashioned, if you want to call it that, way of things is still very much used these days. I mean, I've sat in scoping meetings with pen test companies, and so the internal team has kind of gone into great detail about their architecture and lots of considerations and such. And you can see the pen testers sitting there thinking, I just want to know if it's an AWS test or an API test, and they'll go back and they'll just pick their AWS methodology and API methodology, stick it in a PDF. That's your scope. 3 days this, 3 days that, 2 days reporting. But there's all that information disclosed in that meeting, and it's like, well, they've given you a lot there. Why don't you try and use that in a different way instead of just trying to sort of filter everything out? So I just need to know if it's this methodology or that one, and go back, write the proposal, set a date, do the test. It's like you've kind of like not been sort of trained to sort of listen to that,
Rob, that's really troubling that you've observed that. I mean, I've seen it 1,000 times as well, but to hear it called out is troubling, because you don't keep your ear out so you can just put a number of days on it and figure out how it fits in the Jenga of a project management scheduling system.
Well, maybe I'm doing that because I was guilty of that in the past. There's a good chance of that. But that's probably what you're sort of trained to do, depending on where you work and how you approach things. And maybe I've just not used the right companies, in the past.
Can't possibly comment, but but this is the challenge, and this is, it's a bit like saying, education's education. No, it's not. It can be, rubbish education or extremely sophisticated interactive education. Or another phrase I liked, I don't like phrases that, people commoditize phrases like phishing and red teaming and purple teaming. Done well, these are incredibly high value exercises. The phishing that we see out now these days, and the threat around it is just extraordinary and goes way beyond any of these tools that train people in phishing. And so not all words and phrases are born equal, are they? And it depends on the engagement and the culture of the engagement of the people delivering those services, right?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they're not all the same, are they? And it's kind of like you're not sort of comparing things in a like-for-like manner. And I guess going back to your point about sort of professionalization of the industry, maybe that will come. But if you talk to one consultancy about what they can do with phishing versus another one, that it could be receive something entirely different. In fact, the consultant assigned might deliver something entirely different within the same organization. Where's your sort of quality control? And often that's kind of invisible to buyers of these services, I think, unless you really know what you're buying, of course. Like if you've been a pen tester like me, for example, I'll sort of ask questions around that, but not everybody would, So yeah, I mean, the consistency, is it there? Are you using the same terms, but are they really, are you really describing the same sort of thing? We need to be clear on terminology. But it's getting there, isn't it? I think that there's still it's still a bit loose, isn't it? Really, in the sense that, like one company's describing the same thing as another, but they deliver something completely different to you, or maybe not.
I think if we talk in terms of stories and bringing things alive and outcomes, that can definitely skew things in a different way. So as they say, what do you call it, phishing plus, or and not all phishing is born equal. But the stuff that around MFA bypass now, and some of the smarter stuff takes some of it, especially with mature companies who are again raising the bar, they're still under threat. Takes a lot of thinking and a lot of very careful consideration. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to ask a really poignant question of this. Do you think Rob, that we have lost the critical thinking in our industry, or do you think it's perhaps polarized? So we've got a spectrum of service providers out there. And going back to your view in 2014, do you see some of those visions that you had then starting to materialize now?
Yeah, so I think critical thinking is possibly lacking in some of those services. You can make money as a pen test firm and deliver pretty bog standard methodologies, because it's a regulatory requirement, it's a tick box exercise. You've got the industry is full of extremely smart people, smarter than me, that that apply critical thinking on a daily basis. It's just that sometimes they're forced to deliver services in a certain way. It's almost like we need to sort of better cater for the people we've got, to deliver what they think they need to deliver. It's almost like they're sort of frustrated by the service wrapper to a degree, and the client expectations. But yeah, in terms of what's changing since that talk I did, I guess, in 2014, yeah, I have seen some improvements, but not enough. In many ways, it's been 10 years now, and I can still kind of complain about many of the same things in the industry, really. I mean, what's improved? You tend to, as I say, you tend to get better integrations with issue trackers like Jira, Zero DevOps or whatever. You've got kind of decent portals being spun up for these, more traditional kind of cybersecurity consultancies, so you can kind of manage your information in a portal, and they'll link to things like application security, posture management tools, and solutions like that, and that's all very helpful. But I mean, you still get situations where you'll arrange a pen test and someone will say, well, they were available, they weren't available, then they were, and then they were available when our internal team weren't available, and it's just all that friction. It's like, we got this scope document. It said, AWS and API, what was 7 or 8 days or whatever, despite like an in-depth, a scoping session held. And, we never quite, you just, the friction's all still there, really. And I think that a different way of thinking about things, this is still required, really. I think that, we're more heavily in the cloud generally now, and there's the company is better at DevOps, release cycles are faster, manual pen testing sort of needs to sort of get out of the way of that to a degree. It can't sort of slow teams down, and so there's a bit of a bit of an existential sort of thinking required there, because does it fit does it fit into a rapid release cycle anymore? If you're going to be spending like 2 weeks on a staging environment doing a pen test before a release, and then waiting a week to give them a report that you didn't talk about the findings for during the test. So yeah, unfortunately, still a lot of work to be done, really. I'm sure some companies are doing a lot better than others, but I can only comment on what I've seen, really.
I hear you. I think my smile probably says it all, but sounds like the industry needs some serious doses of business process engineering, different thinking, an awful lot more around consistency, even more than an awful lot more around flexibility, good old-fashioned service and care. It's but what an opportunity that presents in its own right as well. We're coming to time now, Rob, so can I say thank you very much for such an interesting conversation. I'm always smiling when we talk, because you get it, and I think everyone watching this will see that you get it. But for the moment, Robin Fewster, Head of Security Testing and Application Security at Hargreaves Lansdown, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure to have another chat with you. It's always good to talk to you about this stuff. Thank you.